Is the return of Gojo really good for Jujutsu Kaisen? Gojo is undoubtedly the most iconic character to come out of JJK, so everyone is excited to finally have him back after roughly 100 chapters. But just like sealing Gojo had major consequences for the story, his return will inevitably have a similar impact on the story now that it's seen a few changes during this time. So while it's great to have Gojo back, you can't help but wonder if having such a powerful and influential character suddenly jump back into the story might hurt the story's progress. For example, let's talk about the reason Gojo was sealed in the first place. He's just too powerful. Akutami has apparently even said that Gojo was sealed because he is so strong that it screws up the story. Which makes sense because, you know, having magic powers is cool and all, but it's kind of a joke against a guy who can control imaginary mass and bend the laws of gravity however he wants. And this is exactly what we saw prior to his being sealed. When Gojo wasn't present, there was actually some real tension. Sukuna almost killed Yuji. In the Versus Mahito arc, there was always the threat of Nanami or Yuji dying to Mahito. But in the first arc, the newly introduced Sukuna was no match for Gojo. And when Gojo showed up in the Goodwill event, he literally one-shot Hanami while Yuji and Todo were sweating their hearts out. It's pretty clear that when you have Gojo present, there's significantly less tension because at the end of the day, Gojo is so absurdly strong that it's nearly impossible for him to lose. He's not invincible, of course, and he can be beaten as we saw in his fight against Toji. It's just really hard to do. So when Gojo was sealed, it took away that sense of security. The character that was canonically described as the walking talking nuke of the Jujutsu sorcerer world was taken out of play, and suddenly the rules of play changed. Now there was a major power gap, and all of the forces at play were more or less at balance. For example, as soon as they sealed Gojo, Kenjaku and the Cursed Spirits could basically do whatever they wanted during the Shibuya incident. Following that arc, the conservatives in the Jujutsu Sorcerer hierarchy could declare Gojo, Yuji, and the principal criminals, leading to the death of Yaga in the fight between Yuji, Yuta, and Choso. And of course, the Culling Games could only happen with Gojo out of the picture. More obviously, because if he were around, he'd basically punch Kenjaku in the face before he could make any moves and force everyone to play. But the more important part is the fact that the Culling Games only works as well as it does because it is a true battle royale. At its best, a battle royale is an event where everything is up for grabs and anyone can come out on top. You could not have an arc like this with Gojo, because the beauty of these fights is that anyone could potentially win and anyone could potentially die. If you always had the possibility of Gojo popping out of nowhere, then the arc would be 10 times worse than what it is. You wouldn't feel any tension because it'd just be like, oh well, hopefully Gojo shows up. Plus, because the characters had to fight on their own, well, in teams, but more the fact that they had to rely on their own powers. Because of this, you have moments like Maki learning to properly use her abilities. Naturally, now that Gojo is back in the picture, the question becomes, how will he influence the power balance in this arc? Well, before I answer that question, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, had Gojo shown up earlier in the arc, I'd be more worried, because at that point we were still in the battle royale. But at this point, it's pretty clear that the Culling Games are wrapping up. Kenjaku has made his move with the US military, he's captured Tengen, and now he's trying to wrap up the Culling Games to get what he really wants. It seems like the Culling Games are wrapping up and now we're moving to some next big event. Another reason I'm not so worried about Gojo ruining the power balance is because that power balance has gone through a lot of change. In other words, the players we're seeing right now aren't what they were prior to Gojo being sealed. We have Kenjaku, who we had before, but now he's made his plays and we don't know what he has up his sleeve. We have Sukuna in Megumi's body, who is probably the only person that can give Gojo any real trouble in a one-on-one fight. We have Maki, the so-called next Toji, who, by the way, was the only person to ever give Gojo a serious fight before he matured as a sorcerer. And we have all of these other characters that we didn't have before. So not only are there more characters around that can give Gojo a run for his money, but the field has changed such that we don't know how Gojo fits in now. In other words, there's so many new factors that yeah, Gojo is still a walking, talking nuke, but we don't know if he'll just walk up and body people like he used to. I mean, he did just break out of a barrier at the bottom of the ocean, so I'm not questioning his power. I just mean that there's a lot more competent characters in the main crew, so I'm not as worried about Gojo carrying fights at the moment. However, there is a certain problem that still exists. a problem that exists only because Gojo was ever sealed in the first place. JJK for however long has been considered to be one of the dark trio consisting of It, Chainsaw Man, and Hell's Paradise, which is fitting considering the content of the story. Ironically, like I mentioned before, Gojo's presence has always created an optimistic tone in the story. Yeah, bad stuff can still happen, but the second Gojo shows up, it's game over for the bad guys. It is so bad that they had to put together this elaborate plan just to get him out of the picture by sealing him. Even when he's doing nothing, his mere presence gives the readers and the characters this feeling that everything will turn out alright. Obviously, this wasn't the case at all in the Culling games. Like I discussed, Culling games is a battle royale where everything is up for grabs and anyone could die. While this led to the plot consisting of one fight after another, it also led to a slightly darker tone in the story. Darker in the sense that things weren't as optimistic without Gojo to come in and save the day. But now that Gojo is back, there's a serious possibility that the story could revert back to its earlier tone and undermine the change it made the last 100 chapters or so. This isn't so much a question of the power balance. It's more focused on the actual tension or lack thereof purely by having a character like Gojo in the story. So the question becomes, does adding Gojo back to JJK actually hurt the story by ruining the darker tone that fans enjoyed in the last couple of arcs? Again, I'm honestly not that worried. If this were Culling games, then yes. But again, it seems like the Culling games are wrapping up and we're entering the final part of the story. Or the beginning of the final part, anyway. As such, I strongly suspect that Kenjaku and his forces have a number of contingency plans to deal with Gojo now that they've had time to build their power. Seeing as how that's probably the case, there's a stronger chance of Gojo being stopped by the villains. Thus, there's less of a chance that Gojo can just pop into fights and body people whenever he wants. There's also the simple fact that we're getting closer to the end of the story. In any given story, the tension continues to build up as you reach the climax. So I have a hard time imagining this next part of the story failing to be dark like Culling games. Probably not exactly like Culling games, but probably fairly close. So the power balance should be fine, and the dark tone that we've come to enjoy will probably be fine too. Obviously, Gojo can't cause any problems for the story, right? Actually, yes, he 100% can. As much as I think the characters have gotten stronger and Kenjaku and Sukuna probably have all kinds of schemes to fight him, this is still Gojo we're talking about. The dude can control gravity, nuke people with black holes, and look through you at an atomic level. If there was a god in JJK, Gojo is probably as close to it as you can get. Like, the whole reason Akutami took Gojo out in the first place was the simple fact that it's incredibly difficult to write out the plot with a character like Gojo just chilling there. So now that he's back, it's hard to imagine Akutami not having similar difficulties. Because Kenjaku already sealed Gojo once, so I doubt that'll happen again. Best case scenario, Gojo bodies Kenjaku and or Sukuna, and that's it. Worst case scenario, one of these characters pulls out some Deus Ex Machina bullcrap to defeat the others, which is exactly the kind of thing I would hate to see in an otherwise very well structured story so far. So will Gojo suddenly make all of the other characters look like poopy babies again? No, probably not. Will his mere presence in the story ruin the darker tone? No, probably not. But will his godlike power lead to some kind of Deus Ex Machina, where either Kenjaku or Sukuna pull something out of their butt to finally defeat Gojo, or he somehow gains an even more OP ability to stop Kenjaku? Hopefully not, but it is a serious concern. So while Gojo definitely won't ruin JJK, there's at least a few reasons to be cautious now that he's returned. But maybe you disagree. Maybe you think these are exactly the kinds of changes we need. Share your thoughts and say what everyone else thinks down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another JJK discussion like this one, then check out my recent video on character deaths. In that video, I explain why JJK handles character deaths better than Chainsaw Man. You can find it in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.